So today I'm going to be talking about adopting sustainable agricultural practices. What are the barriers and incentives? So again, just to go over sort of where we're going to go with this, we're going to talk a little bit about sustainable development, just to remind everyone, and then look at some of the obstacles for the adoption of sustainable agricultural practices. The other things that we're going to talk about is what are the factors that influence the adoption of beneficial agricultural practices, or often we'll use the term beneficial management practices. And then we're going to look at the factors that influence the adoption of BMPs, look at program design, and finally looking at new markets and how the access for research priorities, how they fit into these things, and then with some conclusions. So just to remind everybody, sustainable agriculture deals with three interconnected pillars: environment, society, and economics. Again, we need to find that balance between the environment, environmental conservation, economic viability, and social equity. As Genevieve just said, economic viability is really important, and that's something that farmers are going to want to be looking at. Again, sustainable agriculture requires meeting the food and environmental needs of the current generation without compromising the future generations. And that's important. When we talk about resilience, that comes into it. And so finally, one of the most important things is building resilience into our systems. That's not only sort of environmental resilience, but also economic resilience and social resilience. And again, the idea is climate change is a priority within agriculture. The building of resilience into our production systems is very, very important. So one of the things that we've done in Quebec, which is a really good thing, is that we've developed our sustainable agricultural plan, and it has very clear goals and objectives. So again, you've all seen this. It's sort of, we want to reduce our pesticide use, and the good thing about this is that we have clear indicators so that they're measurable in terms of how we are doing. So we want to reduce the amount of pesticides being sold. We want to improve soil health. Again, this is really important. So we want 75% of cultivated areas in either winter cover crops or crop residue. And this again builds into soil health and builds in resilience. And I guess we want to increase the amount of organic matter within our agricultural soils. Again, it's important. We want to reduce the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that we're using. We want to look at improving water management. We want a 15% reduction in phosphorus concentration in watercourse, and we want to improve our biodiversity. Again, all of these things will build resilience into our agricultural systems. So one of the things that we have to think about is that there's going to be a distribution of benefits and costs. So when we talk about sustainable development, we have to also think about how are the costs and the benefits being distributed across members of societies. Okay, and so in order for us to adopt these sustainable management practices, farmers are going to have to change from their current practices. Often the change of the production practices and technologies will increase producer costs. So when we start to think about the distribution of those benefits and costs, we're going to be looking at that farmers are going to bear some of the costs of doing this. And again, sometimes those increased costs will build in resilience into the farming system, and therefore they're a benefit to the producer. But in large cases, much of the benefit will be going to society. Again, society is putting pressure on producers and governments to increase the environmental benefits from our sustainable agriculture. So some of society's concerns, including demanding more from the agricultural sector in terms of environmental stewardship. This demand provides a new market opportunities, but it also increases regulation. So we see, again, farmers from the previous speakers worrying about this regulation question that is coming up. When we start to look at new opportunities, we have to look at them from both the domestic market and foreign markets. For example, organic agriculture. But again, when we have organic agriculture, there's also new regulations that go along with how do you make sure you can label your product as organic. This is a study that we undertook with my graduate student, René Waugh, and here what we were looking at is what happens, what is the increased cost of actually providing some of those environmental benefits? Here, this is the Brownlee watershed in the Beauce, and what we wanted to do was decrease non-point source pollution from agriculture. Again, some of the beneficial management practices we included things like buffer strips, reduce pesticide use, no-till, reduce different mechanisms to integrate manure. And so the one thing that I want you to see out of this is that as you decrease the emissions, you decrease the amount of the gross margin going to the watershed. So that means farmers are actually absorbing the cost of that increased environmental benefit. Again, but we also have to think about some of the positive sides to agriculture, sustainable agriculture. Again, not all of the practices are going to be costly to producers. Some of the things that we see when we start to build in sustainable agricultural practices, it reduces risks or have a slight positive income effect. Some examples of this include no-till and cover crops. They've been shown to decrease production risks through better soil and water management. In the prairies in particular, this is very important. And we see that in Quebec too. As people start to go into no-till production and cover crops, they tend to decrease. It gives a better soil management and therefore decreases some of your risk. Another important element deals with the nitrogen management practices, the 4 R's, sort of what is the right rate of nitrogen placement and timing and the source. Again, this can decrease your nitrogen costs and increase your yield. Again, the one thing that we have to remember, though, is that all of these changes in practices will require information and knowledge to be transferred to the producer, probably different equipment and labor. And all of these things can be limiting in terms of the adoption of management practices. So one of the things that we want to talk about is the barriers to adoption. And again, this question of risk and uncertainty. Whether to adopt a sustainable agricultural practice or new technology is a risky choice for producers. Again, they have to choose what alternative to choose, and they're not certain of the success of that probability, of that choice. And so when we start to talk to producers about changing your agricultural practices, we're actually telling them to absorb some risk in doing that. And again, the idea behind it is that if the beliefs about the uncertainty of the outcome and the consequence are entirely personal, that's a farmer decision. And again, the risk perceptions of the producer impacts on what and how information about beneficial management practices or technologies is gathered and should be given. Again, risk preferences or attitudes of the producer plays a role in the adoption process. So this is one of the important elements that we have to take into account, is we have to take into account how the farmer is perceiving these as we develop our programs to actually give some extension. So again, some of the factors that we'll talk about that will influence the adoption process are going to be information and awareness, financial incentives, social norms, some of the internal factors and external factors. Each of these factors, individually or as groups, can influence the adoptions by producers. So again, one of the things that from a government or a university researcher perspective or an advisor's perspective is that we have to identify which of these elements are important and how do we communicate to our producers. So again, some of the things that we want to look at. One is going to be information and awareness. Okay, it plays a really important part in the producer decision-making. It includes the technical information about what the practice is, but we also have to provide information on what is the benefits and the risk of those practices. Again, that's an important part of the process, is to deliver how we deliver that information. Again, often we'll see that farmer-to-farmer information is often the best sources of information, but other sources such as government advisors, farm associations, and universities, we have to include the universities, are good sources of information. Again, having local demonstration sites and training opportunities are important information and awareness sources. One of the things that is good about the RQRAD is the importance we place on the extension or communication elements. Other factors include the finances. As I said before, beneficial management practices create financial risk for the producer. And this risk comes from several sources. It's the purchase of new equipment and the potential impact on yield and prices during the initial adoption stages. To offset some of those financial risks, there are several means of providing financial incentives. These can include subsidy programs, but other mechanisms can also be incorporated here. We can have supply chain incentives and we can have market incentives. So again, this idea of price premiums for organic or for local production is something that we can look at as providing financial support. The other thing is social norms. Producers who perceive their role in society has a major impact on sustainable practices. If they view themselves as being stewards or custodians of the land and production system, they have a much higher adoption rate. Again, developing farmer-to-farmer networks to provide information on stewardship and incorporating the environment in decision-making increases the adoption rate. Again, we want to have local champions who will actually demonstrate how these things work. And again, producers' ability to engage farmer networks and to overcome management challenges is crucial. The other factors that we look at is this idea that we have internal factors. So program design is important. And these things like how do we time new programs and what is the administration paperwork that is associated? We should try to keep those to the minimum. And again, we have to provide the educational technical assistance should be as part of the program. But we also have external factors that play a role in the adoptions. What is society's perception of sustainable agriculture and farmers' role? And that impacts sort of expectations and regulations. Again, we have to look at the change in the structure of agriculture. Large farms have a different choice of alternative benefit management practices than small farms. Again, market access to foreign markets is also another element that will impact us. Again, trade disputes also have an impact on our ability to move trade externally. So some of the programs we from our economic models, we have basically four type of models, program models to increase the adoption of benefit management practices. The easiest one is the pay for practice program. We have this idea of the enhanced pay for practice, and then we have pay for performance, education, and capacity building. So each of them have their own strengths and weaknesses. So when you think about this idea of a pay for practice, that's probably the most common approach to helping farmers. It's basically a cost-sharing program. And again, what happens here is producers are given grants to cover a portion of the cost to implement the specific practice. The strength of this is that, one, it's familiar to producers. Producers tend to see this as a risk-free way to implement the beneficial management practice. They're easy to implement and equitable for producers. However, there are some real weaknesses to this type of approach. It's inflexible in terms of eligible BMPs. There's normally a cap on the total amount that can be spent, which limits the number of producers involved. And often the technical effectiveness is unknown. So again, one of the things that it's an inefficient allocation of our conservation dollars. The enhanced program is basically taking that pay for practice program and add on to it an education component. Again, what we want to do is we want to provide some education and capacity building. Again, in terms of this, we require the producer to go to workshops, training sessions, and peer-to-peer counseling. The idea behind it is that the producers engage in a process, not just the cost-sharing element. the good thing about this, it's still fairly familiar to producers. The important thing is focuses on building capacity, and this can lead to behavioral change. And this is an important element. We're now not just looking at adopt a practice, but we're looking at how do we change the behavior of farmers and how they address their production systems. Again, it also builds trust within the community and between community and government. Some of the weaknesses, it's higher costs, more administrative costs, and greater time requirements for the producer. Okay. The next one is this idea of pay for performance. Again, it's a little bit of a different type of program, is that you're being paid for a quantifiable environmental outcome. Again, something like this is something like carbon trading, where if you incorporated carbon into your soil and it's measurable, then we can sell it in a carbon offset market. Again, it's cost effective, it's flexible, and it's outcome oriented. Again, unfortunately, often its funding can be inconsistent and there's a time requirement. And the final one is just basically a program that provides education and capacity building. Again, here we see that these tend to be a different type of programs. They're often taken by grassroots organizations or nonprofits. And the idea behind this is a behavioral shift to the producers. The one thing we want to talk about is this idea of market opportunities and access. The market is slowly incorporating sustainable agricultural practices into prices. And again, this creates market opportunities, and we also need some new institutions. Again, the idea of labeling on products can improve information to consumers about the sustainability of the product and can generate price premiums. We see today with the question with the US tariffs is that people are now saying, let's buy Canadian, let's buy local. And again, those type of things allow us to actually support local production. Again, price premiums, if they're given for particular types of production processes, they have both a financial and behavioral motivation to adopt the practices. So things like sort of organic agriculture or antibiotic-free chickens, reduced pesticide fruit and vegetables are all things that fall into that. Again, foreign markets can also have particular production requirements, and we have to abide by those rules if we want to access those foreign markets. Again, one of the things that we see is there are new market opportunities. One of the ones that potentially could be a very big one for Quebec is this idea of the carbon offset market. Quebec has a carbon trading system and it allows for unregulated sectors such as agriculture to trade greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, we have 2 agricultural protocols that generate carbon offsets, sort of destruction of methane by covering manure storage facilities and manure anaerobic digestion. Those are good for animal production, but not so much for crop production. What we see in November 2024, the price for carbon was $44 or almost $45 per ton of CO2 equivalent. If we look at the Alberta carbon trading system, they have a lot more agricultural carbon offset programs. And these include nitrous oxide emission reductions, sort of renewable energy. But at one time, they also had things for cover crops and no-till. And we've seen a huge adoption of those practices within Western Canada. And they were actually at one time sold within the carbon market there. Again, carbon offset credits provide financial incentives for producers to adopt BMPs and can generate quantifiable environmental benefits. So Axis 4, what are the priorities for research in the socioeconomic aspects of our network? Again, one of the things that we want to talk about is the economic analysis of agricultural practices and technology. As we saw from the survey, economic viability is exceedingly important. Again, that has to be done at the microeconomic level, where we look at farmers in terms of what is their impact on their gross margins. But we also have to look at the mesoeconomic level, which includes what are the regional impacts within the province, what is the impact in terms of land allocation and those elements and profitability. But we also have to look at it, the macroeconomic. Sort of what's the impact on the total Quebec economy? Because agriculture buys inputs from other sectors of the economy, and that has to be incorporated. We also have to look at exports. That's an opportunity for Quebec. That's important for not only Quebec, but also for other nations to buy our goods. The other elements includes producers' attitudes to adoption. So we have a whole list of experimental economics, choice experiments, other sociological mechanisms that we can identify the practices and technologies that producers want. We also have to look at consumer behavior and rural development. What are the new products that consumers are going to want, and how do we deal with those? The other element deals with this idea of agricultural land as natural capital. So we develop a system of environmental economic accounts for agriculture. That means we're looking at agricultural land as natural capital and also institutional development. This is just a quick slide going back to that study that Renoir undertook. You see here's the cost of providing decreasing the amount of phosphorus, nitrogen, E. coli, and sediment in watercourses. And you see the first graph says that if we set the program or the requirements on each individual farm, the cost is much higher than if we actually set it at the watershed level. Because if we set it at the watershed level, we actually have to develop a nutrient trading mechanism so that we can actually get the farmers who actually have the worst problems to actually provide the greatest amount of benefit. And then finally, in conclusion, we have to look at the factors for adoption. We have to look at sort of producers' perspectives in terms of stewardship, economic and financial incentives, risk attitudes, and we have to address those factors to provide incentives. Again, financial support for adopting sustainable practices is important, but this must be combined with other information, capacity building, and behavioral change. Again, we can't forget about new market opportunities for agriculture. Thank you.